Thank you for joining us for this Texas Tribune event, a conversation between Dan Egan and Texas Tribune environmental reporter Alejandra Martinez about Egan's book, The Devil's Element, Phosphorus and a World Out of Balance, which calls attention to one of the most perilous but little-known environmental issues of our time. Humanity's over-reliance on phosphorus, a vital crop nutrient, is causing toxic algae blooms and dead zones in waterways from the coastal areas of Florida to the Mississippi River Basin and Texas waterways. And diminishing access to phosphorus poses a threat to the food system worldwide. In this Texas Tribune event, Egan sits down with Martinez to discuss his book, how these issues are impacting Texas and Texas communities, and what we can do to address them. This is the second in a series of conversations with Texas-based authors and authors of works focused on issues that matter to Texans. The Texas Tribune is a nonprofit news organization, and we rely on support from folks like you. If you value our events and our journalism, join as a member at texastribune.org/donate. The Devil's Element was published on March 7th, 2023, and our conversation was recorded in September 2023. Here's Alejandra Martinez and Dan Egan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alejandra Martinez. I'm an environmental reporter at the Texas Tribune, and I'm joined here today with Dan Egan, the author of the new book, The Devil's Element, Phosphorus and a World Out of Balance. Egan writes about how phosphorus is critical to life. It's a key component in fertilizer, which keeps our food production alive and us alive too. But the fertilizer we use to grow our crops flows into waterways. Phosphorus from farms, sewage, and industry fertilizes our lakes, rivers, and streams, creating huge algae blooms. A goop Dan Egan describes as thick as oatmeal, poisonous, green like guacamole, and nasty. And to top it all off, our phosphorus reserves in the U.S. are on track to disappear in just a few decades. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having me.
Dan is also the author of the book, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. He's a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and a journalist in residence at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee School of Freshwater Sciences, and is here to tell us more about his book, The Devil's Element. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm really happy to be here.
Dan, I was hoping that you could take us back to when humans first discovered phosphorus. You write about how phosphorus's birthplace was in Germany.
Yeah, there are a couple things going on here. Phosphorus, it's called the devil's element for a number of reasons. And one of them is that it was the 13th element discovered. And it was discovered in the 1600s in Hamburg, Germany, when an alchemist of the time was on the hunt for the mythical philosopher's stone, which was this substance that they believed at the time could turn base metals like lead into gold. And they thought that Earth was ever evolving and that these base metals were on their way to becoming silver, gold, platinum, whatever. And they thought they could hurry the process along if they isolated the substance that was doing that. And this guy, Hennig Brand, believed it could be isolated from human urine. So he did a lot of hocus pocus, cooked a lot of urine, and precipitated out these waxy, glowing phosphorescent nuggets, and that is elemental phosphorus. That stuff doesn't exist on its own in the natural world any more than a styrofoam cup would. It's always bound with oxygen atoms to create phosphates, which is what we use today as fertilizer. But elemental phosphorus has its own potent properties, not the least of which is it explodes, it combusts if it gets heated to just a tick above room temperature, say 83, 84 degrees, it'll just go boom. So this is when phosphorus was discovered in the 1600s. But if you fast forward a couple of centuries, we were on the hunt, we as humans, for phosphorus, even though we didn't have a name for it and didn't know what it was and didn't know that it was coming in this molecule, phosphates. But we did know certain things made stuff grow. And we would learn later that it was phosphorus, specifically phosphate, but I'll use the word phosphorus just for clarity here.
Yeah.
And so if we jump ahead to the early 1800s, England's under constant threat of famine, just because the population was exploding and the croplands weren't, and the soil productivity certainly wasn't. So they started experimenting with anything that they could think of to put on a field to make wheat or turnips or whatever grow. And certain properties, certain things had remarkable fertilizing properties. One of these substances was bone. And backing up a little bit, obviously manure. We've used animal manure for thousands of years, and anything else we could think of. If it worked, we'd keep using it. And they found at that time that bones, for whatever reason, were like magical. So that sent the British on a bone hunt and propelled them into some pretty dark places.
Yeah, and you're talking about, British's population is growing so big, and there's limited agricultural lands. So these are people like starting to get creative with this, right?
Yeah.
And I thought it was just so fascinating reading about the shipments of things like bird bone and bird poop from like Peru.
Yeah, well, they went over to the British. So the Battle of Waterloo was, I can't remember now. Should be better with my dates, but it was around 1815, I think. And
Yeah.
by the 1820s, the British had already realized that bones were making things grow very well, and so they went over to Waterloo, where 40,000 people fell in like 10 hours, and they mined the battlefield. They looted it for all the bones, and enemy combatants as well as their own offspring, and they built specific mills on the English side of the English Channel and ground these things into powder and spread them on crops. But there was only so many bones to be plundered or looted across the battlefields of Europe. And so that sent them, and this is what the story is really about. It's our constant chase for the next fertilizing substance. And so after bones, we went to South America and started plundering the Guano Islands off of Peru, which were, in simple terms, mountains of bird poop. And bird poop is rich with phosphorus. Mm-hmm. And at the time, the islands, I mean, they were stretching more than 100 feet out of the ocean. And people thought at the time that this was going to be an endless supply. We would never run out. And that was in the 1830s. And by the 1870s or 1880s, those islands had played out. And that sent us, when I say us, I mean primarily Western civilization now, on the hunt for new sources. And it turned out that certain types of rocks are rich with phosphorus. They're sedimentary rocks. They're basically the accumulated detritus of life on Earth for millions of years, and they get concentrated. And the mechanisms of how these deposits get so concentrated, how these phosphorus-rich rock deposits get so concentrated is still a little fuzzy, but we know where they are, and we've been mining them with abandon for the last 120 years or so. And as you mentioned at the beginning, we are on track. Most of our reserves in the United States are in Florida, and it's been estimated that those reserves will run out in 3 or 4 decades, at which point we're going to become dependent on other countries for our nutritional security, which you could argue is a lot more important than energy security, because there's workarounds to carbon-based fuels, but there's no substitute for phosphorus. It's in every living cell on the planet, and it's also, in many cases, the one thing a crop needs to grow. The other 2 primary nutrients are nitrogen, which we can pull out of the air, and potassium, deposits of which are still abundant. So the story of the hunt for phosphorus, it's not over. We're in the middle of it.
Yeah, and I want to back up. You were mentioning these rocks, right? And as you were speaking earlier, the story of phosphorus in some ways is a little yucky and icky and a little complicated. But there's this one story that you write about a man who picked up this like really interesting orange rock along the shoreline, thinking that maybe it's like a rare gem or something. And he was, I believe, on his way home to try to give this as a gift to his wife, but things went wrong. So what happened there?
Well, as I was mentioning, when they first isolated phosphorus in the 1600s, it had this bewitching property of glowing in the dark and really casting off no heat until it explodes. And so that happens at 80 plus degrees Fahrenheit. And so, along with phosphorus eventually being recognized as a critical fertilizer, it became a weapon. And as I mentioned, Hamburg was the birthplace of phosphorus in 1669, I believe. In 1943, Hamburg was burned to the ground when the Allies bombed it with incendiary, with firebombs, many of which were loaded with phosphorus. Not all the phosphorus exploded, and if it hits water, it congeals into like this pebble. It looks like a little nugget of amber. And coincidentally and unfortunately, the Baltic Sea region near Hamburg, Germany, not too far north, and the Elbe River, which runs through Hamburg, are famous for amber. And amber is basically fossilized tree resin because that area used to be a conifer forest. And so people have long been hunting for little nuggets of amber, and recently they've been, because I guess they're hunting harder than they used to, they're picking up little nuggets of phosphorus that were left over from these bombs that were dropped. They put it in their pocket or put it wherever, and it heats up to a tick above 80 Fahrenheit, and boom. And that's what happened, unfortunately, to this gentleman. He thought he had actually found a piece of fossilized oyster shell.
Wow.
He was very explicit. I don't know why, but he wanted to make it clear that he wasn't looking for phosphorus. He was just looking for various fossilized items along the Baltic coast. So he puts it in his pants, and all of a sudden his leg it bursts into flames, and he sticks his hand into his pocket to see what's going on. He's really confused. He's like, I don't smoke. I don't have a lighter. Why is my leg on fire? And he put his hand into his pocket to see what might be down there. And there was just this goo that he pulled out, and it had his finger. His fingers were like birthday candles. They were on fire all of a sudden. Yeah, so he instinctively went into the water, which put the flames out. But when he'd leave the water, it would flare back up. And they didn't. He was alone. Fishermen down the beach, called for an ambulance. They were going to bring him out with a helicopter, but they thought he might take down the helicopter, so they eventually put him in the back of an ambulance, and I think he suffered burns to about 40% of his body, and he's recovered, but he's severely burned. And this isn't a real isolated incident. You can just Google phosphorus amber pebble explode, and you'll see stories. I wouldn't say it's happening every day by any stretch, but it happens a number of times a year in that region. And so Hamburg is really an interesting place because it's where phosphorus was discovered. It's where it was burned to the ground. Or it's a place that was burned to the ground in World War II by phosphorus. And we'll probably get to this in a little while, but it's also becoming a cutting edge center for recapturing phosphorus in our waste stream and reusing it as fertilizer, which is really what this story is about. It's a big loop. It's the idea that phosphorus circles in and out of the living world, but it never goes away. So like we were talking about manure earlier. In simple terms, like a cow in a pasture, cow eats the grass, cow poops, poop grows more grass, cow eats the grass, cow poops. And it's this virtuous, never-ending loop. But that loop we cracked when we found these rock deposits. You could argue we cracked it when we started using bones and bird poop, but we really cracked it and straightened it out. So it no longer is the virtuous circle of life, like right out of the Lion King. It's a straight line, and it runs from mines to croplands, and from there it flows down whatever's not taken up by a crop, and most of it well, I can't say most of it. Much of it is not taken up. It's washed off the landscape. And where does it go? It goes into rivers and streams, and there it's proven that it doesn't just grow corn crops or soybeans really well. It grows algae really well, and that's really the root of this scourge of blue-green algae that is plaguing states across the country and countries around the world.
Yeah, and you talk about in your book this so-called like phosphorus paradox. Can you kind of explain what you meant by that? And
Yeah, sure. So it's been a miracle. It's why we have like 9 billion people or whatever on the planet right now. This would not have happened without phosphorus. I mean, when we really started mining it, there were less than 1 billion people, I believe, or about 1 billion people. So it's been essential for our success as a species to produce so many of ourselves. Um, but we're starting to run out of it. As I said, this story, in a way, we're in the middle of it because it's always a hunt for phosphorus. And we've been able to use it, with kind of reckless abandon for the last century, much the way we use these deposits of guano, and prior to that, these deposits of bones on the battlefields. We burn through it. And the paradox here is, particularly here in the United States, we're burning through our reserves at an unsustainable pace. At the same time, we're fouling our waters. So we're overusing it and we're running out of it, and it has us on a collision course. So that's really the paradox, the fact that we have too much of this stuff right now, but pretty soon we're not going to have enough.
Yeah, you really get into like our high dependence on phosphorus, kind of like an addiction to it, this overuse. And you mentioned that we're hitting like this peak phosphorus. So is there a substitute for phosphorus?
No, no, there is no substitute for phosphorus. It is life's bottleneck. And it's like I mentioned, it's in every living cell. But that doesn't mean we're going to run out of this stuff. It's inevitable that we'll run out of this stuff because we can also use it over and over and over and over and over. But we're not doing that. We're not doing enough to capture what's put on the field or capture what's coming off the fields. We're not managing manure properly because manure is rich with phosphorus. And too often, I don't know about the state of things in Texas, but manure here in the middle of Dairyland, I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Manure, is a nuisance. I was mentioning earlier the lengths that the British would go to when they found something that would make a crop grow. If they saw a modern sewer or manure lagoon, on one of these concentrated animal feeding operations, one of these factory farms, we look at it too often as just yuck, and they would see it as yum. They would see it as full crops, and that's where we've got to get back to that. Um, we have enough of it. We're just not using it wisely. It's been estimated that only 20% of the stuff that comes out of the ground that is mined, phosphorus today, makes its way into food on our plates. The rest is just wasted during mining, processing, application. It's a very inefficient system, and we've had the luxury of not having to be efficient. But now it's kind of the issues coming to a head, both in the terms of food security in the decades to come and in fouled waters. Water's just, made unusable by toxic algae.
Yeah, talking about waters, I really like the section in your book kind of going into the use of phosphorus and the rise of like the detergent industry. So how did the evolution of a washing machine play in the rise of our overconsumption of, or I guess overusage of phosphorus?
Yeah, that's a great question because you don't think of the two together, or you don't anymore, but we used to. So back in the 1950s, after World War II, when washing machines started making their way into basements and homes across the country, it was realized that traditional soap just wasn't strong enough to get a load of wash clean. It couldn't compare to a good hand scrubbing. So the chemists of the time set to work on creating an artificial soap, and they did that. And for complicated chemical reasons, phosphorus proved to be a critical ingredient to modern detergent. So much so that it was like a box of detergent was almost a box of phosphorus. And so all of a sudden in the 1950s and 60s, our lakes start turning a soupy green. I don't think any lake suffered as badly or as publicly as Lake Erie did. In the 1960s and 70s, it was being called America's Dead Sea. Dr. Seuss wrote the Lorax in 1971 or 72, and he specifically took a crack at Lake Erie. And people were pretty freaked out by this. Same stuff's going on today, and I'm wondering when they're going to get freaked out. But they got freaked out back in the late 1960s, probably when rivers started burning in Ohio, and that was a symptom or a sign of not just phosphorus overdosing, but chemical overdosing overall. But at that point, nobody knew what there was so much pollution going into the lakes and the rivers. They didn't know what was causing this explosion in algae. And this is a really interesting story. The Canadians decided to go big at getting to the bottom of the problem. And people had suspected that phosphorus, because it is a fertilizer was playing a critical, if not the critical role in it. And the detergent industry was saying, nope, 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 it's not us. It's all manner of chemicals in modern society that are washing into the lakes. The Canadians decided to put that argument to the test. And what they did was they went up into far northwestern Ontario, into this wild, uninhabited area, and they set aside dozens of lakes. And they started treating these lakes like test tubes. And by that, I mean they started poisoning the lakes with various pollutants to see what would happen. And in one of the most famous experiments up there, I think it was in the early 1970s, they took one lake that was like peanut shaped and they cut it in half with like a giant shower curtain, a big polyurethane curtain from the surface all the way to the bottom. And then they gave, at the time, the two of the other big suspects were carbon and nitrogen. So both sides of the lake got carbon and nitrogen. One side of the lake also got phosphorus. And in 2 weeks, that side of the lake was as green as a golf course, and the other side of the lake hadn't exploded at all. So they realized that it was phosphorus that was, as the biologists will say, the limiting factor. It was what a lake needed to suffer an algae explosion. So this picture changed environmental law, environmental history in the United States and Canada. I mean, it's from that we got the Clean Water Act. And from the Clean Water Act, we got a vast, dramatic, and pretty much complete reduction in phosphorus, detergents, and washing machine soap. And the lakes recovered just as the scientists predicted they would. They had modeled it. They put a number on what Lake Erie could handle in a year. They regulated down to that. And by 1985, Lake Erie had recovered so dramatically that Dr. Seuss went and pulled that line from the Lorax that was making fun of how polluted Lake Erie was. Unfortunately, if he were alive today, he may want to put it back because now we're back with a soupy mess again. But this time it's not detergent, it's agriculture. Because when we got the Clean Water Act in 1972, agriculture was largely left alone. And the reason was at the time they were thinking that the volume is relatively small and the problem is so diffuse. There's so many nutrients, both on croplands and just in urbanized areas, that controlling what washes off the land would be too difficult. So agriculture was largely left unregulated, but agriculture's changed a lot in the last 50 years. And it's no longer as dispersed or just diffuse as it once was, hence the name concentrated animal feeding operations. And those things are, so in regulatory parlance, there's point source, which is a pipe or a smokestack, something you can cap or plug, and there's non-point. And agriculture was considered non-point. But if you go to a modern farm today and you see one of these sewage or manure lagoons, you would call that point source because that's a point of pollution. And it's also a point of, or an area rich with fertilizer, which could be feeding us tomorrow if we get a better handle on it.
I definitely feel like, reading your book, like late 1960s, early 1970s was like definitely a turning point in realizing phosphorus is turning our lakes green and murky. And since then, and when that happened, there was, environmental regulations that helped us get our waterways in a healthier level, right? But now I wanted to ask just like how is both, agriculture, but also climate change playing a role in the increase of toxic algae blooms?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, agriculture is playing a huge role in it. And there's been arguments to revisit the Clean Water Act and to start better regulating what goes on the landscape, which means better regulating what goes in the water. Compounding the problem with the volume of phosphorus spilling off of ag lands into rivers and lakes is the fact that, with climate change, we're getting warmer temperatures, and this toxic algae, it's primitive. It's nothing, that isn't natural. It's not technically an algae. It's a photosynthesizing bacteria, cyanobacteria, also called blue-green algae.
Which we see a lot of that in Florida.
In Florida, in Texas, in Wisconsin, right out the office window where I was working a few years ago, I was doing a story on this for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and there was a lagoon adjacent to Lake Michigan that was being set up for a water skiing like world championship or something. and it was Golf Course Green, and they canceled that event like 5 days before it happened. And I had been working with my window open. And once that happened, I shut the window because this algae doesn't just cause a problem for people who might swim in it or drink in it. It can aerosolize, and the toxins that it contains can do some really bad stuff to your lungs. And there's emerging concerns that it's also um, linked to increased incidence of neurodegenerative diseases like ALS. And there's no causation, but there have been studies of people like clusters of ALS or ALS-like diseases around lakes that are infested with this algae.
Yeah,
So it's
you
not just Florida; it's Lake Tahoe. Just in the last decade, it's become Lake Superior, which people thought was too cold and sterile to ever support this kind of a bloom, and it's here, and it's not going anywhere until we better control what's coming off the land.
Yeah, I think something that really even shows the health impacts is you start the book with a Florida man running from the cops and jumping into the water as his last chance, I guess, of escape.
Mhm.
Um, but once he gets into the water, trying to swim for dear life, I guess, he starts getting incredibly sick really fast.
Yeah, yeah, and the police knew exactly what he had done, and this is all on body cams, footage. The guy jumps in and he just immediately starts screaming, "Help! Help! I can't breathe," because it's a toxic, potent fume, and then he got some in his mouth and he was vomiting, and they're coaching him to dog paddle to the canal wall. They're calling for ropes and a boat, and they're yelling, "That is nasty stuff. It's going to kill you." And he did make it to the water's edge, and they hoisted him up and they hosed him down like he was. They actually comported themselves very well. I mean, they were genuinely concerned about the guy, and they're washing his mouth out and stuff. But he was carrying in his car that he had fled from. Was carrying drugs, and he was taken to was allegedly carrying drugs. I don't know what happened with the case, but he was taken to the hospital and then booked. Um, yeah, and that's just that's a fact of life in Florida right now. On too often on both the Gulf and the Atlantic coasts, and that's because in the middle of the state is Lake Okeechobee, which is the largest, second largest next to Lake Michigan, freshwater lake wholly in the continental United States. And it's also like a big petri dish because there's so much agriculture in Central Florida, and that lake is so warm and shallow and flat. And these are all things that the cyanobacteria needs. So
Yeah,
in
you
the
write
summer,
you write about, like, how people are actually just, not only concerned about water quality in their lake, but how that is impacting their personal health and their property values around the area.
yeah, yeah. I mean, Florida is a really interesting case study because the central center part of the state is relatively unpopulated, but you've got all this algae in this lake, and this lake is contained by a dike, and the dike is under constant threat of failing if too much water gets in or it gets overtopped, and tens of thousands of people could be underwater in a matter of hours if that were to happen. So the Army Corps of Engineers discharges, not every year, they haven't had to do it yet this year, although it's gotten pretty close, discharge this contaminated water to the Atlantic coast and to the Gulf Coast to keep levels in Lake Okeechobee safely low. And that means these communities that don't really play a big role in causing these algae outbreaks end up receiving it. And you're right, it's made a lot of people sick, and there's a lot of people worried about property values, and there's no easy solution in sight. It's a problem that's going to be around for a while. So this is all kind of doom and gloom, but
I was gonna say that, like, I'm thinking about, here in Texas and especially Central Texas where people go to, we just had a Labor Day holiday. People go to rivers and streams and lakes to enjoy that during
mhm.
those, 3-day weekends or something. And we're talking about this doom and gloom of, this real problem happening. And I wanted to just, how do you see this playing out in Texas, and what can other, I guess, states that maybe haven't seen this as big as in Florida do to prepare for that?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. And this book isn't prescriptive saying we need to do this, this, and that.
Yeah.
It's just trying to connect dots. It's not really trying to point fingers, but more shine lights and say, if we do this, this is going to happen. And right now, what we're doing is we're putting too much chemical fertilizer and manure on the croplands. For a long, long time, the chemical fertilizer is getting more expensive, but for decades, it was the philosophy was if a little's good, a lot is better, just in case. And so more would go on the landscape than was needed. And so there's a lot of phosphorus still built up in the soils that it's going to leach out for a while. We can't just flip a switch and it's going to be problem solved, but we can get a better handle on how what goes on croplands and what comes off is regulated. Um, that's a big step, and that would probably take an amendment to the Clean Water Act, which the EPA has known for the last decade. They've said that until we get a handle on this non-point source pollution, we're not going to see an improvement in our water quality. So how do you do that? Well, as I was mentioning earlier, some of these farms, a lot of people have a problem with factory farms, and I'm agnostic. I don't really, that's not something that I'm, from this perspective, really concerned about. If anything, I think it's potentially beneficial because once it's concentrated, that's kind of like the first rule of pollution control is consolidate it, get your hands on it, and now you can treat it. Well, the big farms are doing that by having all these animals pooping in a very small area, and then they have a lagoon or a massive tank full of this stuff. Up here in Wisconsin, we're starting to recognize it as the valuable resource that it being manure that it is. We've started building digesters anaerobic digesters to strip the methane out of the manure, and it's not a big leap to go from there to stripping out the nitrogen that's in manure and the phosphorus. And that stuff can be processed into something every bit as pure as what's coming out of a chemical fertilizer factory. More importantly, it's concentrated so you can afford to move it. Right now, the rule of thumb is that farmers can't move their manure more than 10 miles until they start losing a lot of money because it's not like a cow pie anymore. It's liquefied, so it can be sprayed on crops. So it's just sloshing around in these tankers. And if we can concentrate it, dry it, pelletize it, we can monetize it, and we can extend the resources or the reserves of phosphorus rock that we have in the ground. So that's one thing that we need to start looking at. How we get there, regulatorily, politically, socially, I think only through education, and that's what I'm trying to do with this book. The other thing that we can do is take a hard look at ethanol. I mean, everybody except for corn farmers and ethanol producers recognizes this as bad public and environmental policy. 40% of the corn that we're growing in the United States today ends up in our gas tanks. And that's just doesn't make a lot of sense. And that requires also a lot of energy and fertilizer inputs. So if we could take 40% of the crops that we're growing right now and save all the inputs that requires for future generations, we'll have cleaner water and we'll have, a richer source of nutrients, fertilizers for crops in the future.
And going back to Germany, you mentioned that there are, there's local universities, I think, or universities working on how to deal with, I guess, human waste and how
Yeah.
to, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, human waste is a rich potential resource for phosphorus, and it has been that way, for tens of thousands of years. Likely, I know thousands of years. But we really today, when we treat water, we don't do a really good job of treating it for its nutrients, its nitrogen and its phosphorus. And it doesn't have to be that way. Germany's got a law coming online, I think in 2029, that demands that for the big wastewater treatment plants, essentially all the phosphorus has to be pulled out. And that costs money, but their argument is we need to protect our waters, and we also don't have a good domestic supply of phosphorus. We need this as a resource. So that brings us back to Hamburg, Germany, where it was discovered, a place that was burned down by phosphorus, and now it is on the cutting edge of phosphorus recovery from the human waste stream. And they're building systems. I went and toured one on the banks of the Elbe River that I think it's online now, but it basically, you know, pulls the phosphorus out of that waste stream and puts it in a form that, and they're clear to say that, you know, it isn't food grade. We're not, you know, because phosphorus is in a lot of products. It's in Coca-Cola because it's what makes things tart and fizzy, not fizzy, but makes the flavor pop, if you will. Um, what they're producing is you know basically lab grade phosphorus, and it's going to be used for fertilizer, and it's going to happen at, you know, probably all across Europe in the coming decade or a little bit more, and it should probably be coming to the United States. It's just really an ethic that we've gotten away from. We've gotten stuck on this notion that you use it once and flush it away, you know, once, one and done, and you know
You mean like use phosphorus and then once it's used, we're done?
we're done with it. We put it in the water, and then the water is telling us something's wrong in the form of these toxic algae outbreaks. So and so this again, it's like it's the flip side of the paradox. If we do this, we protect our water and we preserve our cache of phosphorus nutrients. I'll just, you know, one of the stories that I tell in this book, which is really kind of a compilation of a bunch of stories and how phosphorus strings them all together. But we started running into soil fertility problems here in the United States, like really early on. You know, in a matter of like 3 generations, we were burning our croplands up, and they were requiring enormous phosphorus inputs at that point. And there was a soil scientist who went over to Asia, to Korea, Japan, and China, and he wrote a book called Farmers of 40 Centuries. And he wanted to answer the question, how can these guys be growing, you know, rice and whatnot on the same patch of land for tens of thousands of years when we are, or thousands of years, when we are basically in trouble in 50 or 60 years? And what he witnessed was, you know, a remarkable enterprise of thrift. It was human waste being composted in a fashion that it could be reapplied to the croplands, and you know the way they handled their manure. They didn't waste a drop of it. And this guy writing in 1909 said, "This is absolutely necessary, and there is no doubt in my mind that the day is coming when we are going to have to be just as thrifty and resourceful."
Mm.
And you know we're on that path right now.
Yeah, we talk about this resource depleting. Do you foresee the price of this resource going up, and they're, you know, leading to food shortages or, you know,
Yeah, yeah, that happened in 2008. And you know, and ethanol was a big part of this problem. But yeah, there was a fertilizer shortage, and then there was a food shortage, and there were riots in places like the well, India and oh gosh, it was Western and Eastern Hemisphere. I was just doing kind of a news journalism search for stories from 19 or 2008, and there were conflicts popping up everywhere, and people were saying this is a window into the future. And one of the big concerns is when we run out, and there, you know, there is a day when we will run out, or it'll become just really, really expensive. We're going to have to go somewhere else for it. And 70 to 80% of the world's reserves are now concentrated in Morocco and Western Sahara, which you know aren't the friendliest places for you know the United States right now. So you don't have to completely run out of the stuff to run into trouble. You know,
yeah,
it's regional shortages. Yeah.
in that case, you know, US would become dependent on other countries for this resource.
Yes. Just like, you know, we would like to be energy independent, I think it's more important that we are nutritionally independent. And we can do that. We can stay, you know, right now we largely are nutritionally independent, but once our reserves play out, um, all bets are off. And like I said, you don't have to run out of it completely to have tensions flare. Already in Western Sahara, which is occupied by Morocco, there's been a low grade war going on that centers largely over a phosphorus mine in Western Sahara, and the native people of the Sahara see that as their, you know, their property, and Morocco sees it as its own, and this mine operates behind a militarized berm that has literally the berm stretches like 1,600 kilometers, and there's millions of landmines and lots of weaponry that are separating the two sides. And they've had a ceasefire largely successfully since the 1990s, but now violence is starting to flicker again, and it's driven over this phosphorus mine. Could be a window into the future.
And going back to new technology out of Germany, that's kind of the reuse of human waste, like kind of to close that line and make it a circle, back a circle. What are the challenges in getting buy-in for something like that?
Well, the yuck factor, right? People just instinctively don't like the idea of their food coming from their waste, but that's just a cultural flaw of ours because it wasn't always this way. Like the big cities of Europe, they called it night soil. And it was basically before there was plumbing, they would have to cart the waste out of the city limits and they would cart it out and it would be composted. And on those carts would come back food from the farms. And when we built sewers, that was really, in the West here, that was a signature moment when we basically really cracked that phosphorus loop and straightened it into a line because we started putting it into the underground pipes that flowed into, rivers across Europe and then across North America. So that's only been going on since the 1850s or 60s or so. That's pretty short-lived in our history with agriculture. And we need to get over that. We need to realize that stuff is born to die, decompose, and become something new again.
Yeah, like we need to get over it if we want to keep eating and having nutrition and just, yeah,
Yeah, and clean water too.
exactly. Yeah. And, um, you know, when I finished the book, I'm like, wow, this journalist wrote a whole book about phosphorus. And what led you to writing this? Did you ever think you were going to be dedicating a whole book to this element?
No, no. So when I wrote this Great Lakes book, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes, I did a chapter on Lake Erie, and I was up there in 2014 when, a bloom of this toxic algae, the toxin specifically from that algae, made its way into the drinking water system in Toledo, and Toledo had to, issue a do not drink order and basically shut down the water supply for a half a million people for 3 or 4 days in early August of 2014. And this wasn't a case of boil the water and then you can drink it and we're going to get everything online, our treatment systems back up and running, and things will be good. If you boiled that water, you would only concentrate the toxin.
Mm.
So they had to bring in tanker trucks. The National Guard was called in to bring tanker trucks to supply drinking water and bathing water to half a million people. They were bringing in pallets of baby formula because because babies need to eat. Um, that got my attention. And when I finished the Great Lakes book, the publisher asked if I was interested in doing another book. And I said, yeah, I'd like to do something on phosphorus because this is a critical issue and it's not unique to the Great Lakes. It is, something that everybody who drinks water should be thinking about. So, and then when I heard about Waterloo and how they were mining the battlefields for food on their table, I thought, yeah, this would be a fun book to write. And so, was it fun? It's like I really don't think it's a doom and gloom book. It's just it's something we need to be aware of so we can have a soft landing rather than a crash.
Yeah, going back to you saying, this book is about educating people. What do you really hope that someone who's reading this will take away from it at the end?
I think they will connect what's going on in the land with what's happening in their water.
Mm.
And too many people too often just kind of throw up their hands and think, well, this is just natural. And it's not any more natural than the fouled waters of the 1960s were because of phosphorus in chemical detergent. It was asking the lakes and rivers to handle more than they could, and that's what we're asking today. And we've got to back off from that. And in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we did that. Right now, we're not. I don't know what it's going to take. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland famously burst into flames in 1969, and that made its way, to news magazines and newspapers across the country. And that was like the moment where people realized that they'd gone too far. You can't have rivers burning. Well, we can't have people living on the edge of the world's largest freshwater resource, not able to safely drink their water with treatment. And that's exactly what happened in 2014. And it's likely to happen again. And a lot of people at that point thought this is the Cuyahoga moment for the 21st century. And the mayors of all the Great Lakes cities got together in Chicago and said, we've got to change. This can't happen again. And really, not much has changed. So we're still vulnerable. So what I hope people get out of it is they get educated and they realize that A, we've got a fertilizer crunch coming, and B, fouled waters don't have to be so. They should be swimmable and fishable and drinkable. That's the goal of the Clean Water Act. And we were well on our way by the 1980s, but now we've kind of hit a wall.
Mm. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dan. Where can people learn more about your work?
They can learn about my work by reading a book. So it's
Yeah.
Devil's Element, Phosphorus in a World Out of Balance. And so that picture, that's Lake Erie. It looks like flames or something.
Yeah.
That's a toxic algae bloom on Lake Erie. And by the S is that's a boat, a research boat. I would not want to be on that boat.
No, I can already think about the smell and just the
Yeah,
headache maybe that I would have going home.
yeah. So yeah, that book and The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. They're not just about this book specifically. Really, isn't about the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes book is really about our modern relationship with water.
Dan, thank you so much for joining the Texas Tribune to talk about your book.
Thanks so much for having me.